Support for your public radio station comes from our members and from Renaissance Academy Charter School of the Arts, a public elementary school in Rochester with an arts-integrated curriculum designed to help children unlock neural pathways, overcome trauma, and thrive. Community support helps sustain programs and resources. More at renacad.org.
From WXXI News, this is Connections. I'm Evan Dawson. Our connection this hour was made on a visit to Cuba. Two congressional Democrats recently toured Cuba to get a better sense of how American sanctions were affecting the Cuban people and to assess what an American military action might do. Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal and Congressman Jonathan Jackson wrote a piece for the New York Times in which they said, quote, "Touring a Cuban hospital, we saw women in the final days of their pregnancies trudging up flights of stairs, the elevators inoperable without power. The hospital staff members struggled to get to work without fuel for their cars. During blackouts, doctors sometimes have to manually pump ventilators to keep babies alive. As members of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, we spent 5 days in Cuba in April to better understand the humanitarian impacts of America's month-long energy blockade of the island. We came away shocked by the inhumane effects of the policy, whose goal appears to be strangling the economy until the Cuban people are brought to ruin and the country is available, as President Trump put it, for the taking." End quote. In fact, President Trump has said that Cuba is next on his list of international targets for military strikes or wars. And we're going to hear what he said about that coming up. He has joked that the United States could pick off Cuba on its way back from Iran. But the congressional Democrats who toured Cuba warn, quote, "Further destruction in Cuba, including military action, would lead only to greater economic collapse and more Cubans fleeing the island," end quote. So what do Cubans want? There are some parallels to the struggles of the Venezuelan people and the Iranian people. We're talking about populations who largely have despised their own leadership and have suffered under brutal repression. Is a military strike the right course of action? How about another war, or really a regime change operation it would be? My guests this hour are here to discuss it from their perspectives. Jason Barber is site manager for the International Plaza with the Ibero-American Development Corporation. And Jason's mother and grandparents immigrated from Cuba. Nice to see you. Thank you for being back here.
Thank you.
Luis Martínez is a management consultant. He's a former candidate for New York State Senate. And he was born in Cuba, grew up in Cuba until the age of 12, until coming to the United States. Nice to see you back here.
Muchas gracias. Igualmente.
So if we could here, Rob, we got that sound with Trump. Can we start with that? Let's listen to President Trump at a recent event, really kind of joking about picking off Cuba, as he says.
An architect who's really talented, has done a lot of work for him. He's got a flair, a beautiful Hispanic flair in particular. And he comes from originally a place called Cuba, which we will be taking over almost immediately. No, Cuba's got problems. We'll finish one first. I like to finish a job. On the way back from Iran, we'll have one of our big, maybe the USS Abraham Lincoln aircraft carrier, the biggest in the world. We'll have that come in, stop about 100 yards offshore, and they'll say, "Thank you very much, we give up."
That's President Trump. So let's listen to Secretary of State Rubio, and then we'll listen to the Congresswoman as well, who recently toured Cuba. This is Secretary of State Marco Rubio at the White House at a recent event talking about Cuba.
But the bottom line is their economy doesn't work. It's a non-functional economy. It's an economy that has survived. That revolution, it's not even a revolution, that thing they have has survived on subsidies from the Soviet Union and now from Venezuela. They don't get subsidies anymore, so they're in a lot of trouble. And the people in charge, they don't know how to fix it. So they have to get new people in charge.
Now, Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal was one of the members of that congressional delegation, and I want to listen to some of what she had to say more about her trip.
In January, Trump issued an executive order threatening tariffs on any country supplying fuel to Cuba. This was this January, just a few months ago. And oil shipments from Venezuela, that's where Cuba had been getting its oil, were halted after the U.S. operations to kidnap Nicolas Maduro. Since January, only one Russian tanker of oil has made it to Cuba. In fact, it landed just a couple of days before I landed. And one tanker has enough oil basically for 10 to 14 days of Cuba's oil needs. So it's a very limited amount of time. Now, Russia has said they're going to send another tanker. I was in conversations with the ambassadors from Mexico and some other places, and I know other countries in Latin America are trying to figure out how to get oil there, but it is a crisis beyond imagination. Just this past Friday, on May 1st, Trump signed a broad executive order that widens sanctions and allows for new penalties, similar to what we have for Iran and Russia, against foreign banks and firms that are dealing with Cuba, and it also reinforces the ban on U.S. tourism. I have called these sanctions an economic bombing of the infrastructure of Cuba.
All right, so that's Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal of Washington State there. So that's some of the perspective in Washington on Cuba. Let me ask our guests. I'll start with Jason. There's a lot of sort of glib talk about taking over Cuba here. What do you make of that?
Oh, I mean, it's a lot of talk, but I mean, for many of us who've grown up within the Cuban diaspora, with family, I literally was just talking to my cousin Carlos, who left 2 years ago because of the July 11th protest. And he's arguing like they're going to destroy the infrastructure when there is no infrastructure. There's no roads. The railroads barely work. The ports are, 50, 60 years old. Hospitals have already been collapsing since the 90s. So we're in a structure that, he said it perfectly, and we were just talking about it. Like, all this is doing is making hell more like hell for these people. And it's unifying, from what he's been told from people on the island, this sense of more hatred towards the American government, that they, and it just strengthens the government. It doesn't, and it hurts the people.
So this posturing, you think, strengthens the Cuban leadership?
Yeah.
But is it possible that a regime change would lead the Cuban people to feel like they have, in a sense, been liberated?
Well, there was a moment, like in July in 2021, there was that moment where there was a strong regime change, and one of the different factors was economics. This is right at the beginning of Trump's the beginning of the pandemic. You have all these issues happening, but you have a group of young, predominantly African Americans, educated population protesting this regime change. Now they have nothing to they can't. They're not allowed to protest. It's been illegal since 1967. They're not allowed. There's no real education on government structures of how to get candidates, and none of that has existed since the Constitution of 1967. So it's not going to create what they think it's going to create. It's just going to create more misery for the people. The government's just going to clamp down and say, "Look at them! Look! Castro told us for 60 years, America's a fat, ugly pig, and now
they hate you.
They hate you, and the exiles hate you, even though many of the exiles have, as you know, and we both know, we've supported our families." Mm-hmm. Oh, totally. For 60 years. Totally. My first memories are loading up bags to go onto airplanes, that were twice the size of my tia, mm-hmm. But it was $1,000 bill, like $1,000 or $100 sneakily US dollars snuck in between pillowcases or DVD players, mm-hmm. or anything they could sell on the mm-hmm. island to, we would load them up with bags, and then my aunt would come back with a tiny little bag, but we would drop duffel bags onto the planes in Toronto so that they can, sell it on the island. So we've always been known that we've supported people.
So before I get Luis's take here, let me just ask you, if you don't think a regime change strike or an operation would actually benefit the Cuban people, what would benefit the Cuban people?
I think in many ways opening up an economic dialogue would benefit the Cuban people, like allowing the Cuban people to actually want to create some economic growth, which was happening for a short time, but under the Obama years. But even under the Obama years, the Cuban government took their part of it. I remember having a lot of people go to Cuba, say, "Oh, I went to Cuba, I loved it. I got to go to here, went here," and I was just sitting there going, like, "Yeah, but you're not giving money to the people.
Right.
You're just giving money to the regime.
Which is why a lot of administrations, American administrations, have said, we're not going to open up with you because the people aren't going to benefit.
Yeah.
So with this regime in place, what you're describing, how do you get around that? If you're just going to try to open up economic relations, but you know the regime is going to hoard the wealth for themselves, what can you do?
Welcome to being Cuban.
Yeah.
Welcome to growing up with this is my whole, I'm 43 this year, and I've known this my whole life. I've seen this story my whole life.
Feels like there's no good answer.
There is no good answer because it's there's no black and white answer when it comes to Cuba.
If there was a simple answer, we'd have done it, you think?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So, Luis, from your perspective, let's start with this. Do you want to see the American military intervene with a regime change strike, some kind of operation, et cetera?
Not quite like that. Here's what I have in mind. It's a carrot and stick approach. I'm sure that the current leadership in Washington is offering some carrots to the so-called president of Cuba now. I don't even name his name. Canel somebody.
Yeah.
Miguel Diaz-Canel?
Yeah.
That guy. Because he doesn't run anything. It's Raul Castro behind the scenes is running everything. So I'll say Castro. So the Castro regime has two options, the carrot or the stick. The carrot is that they can go off to Russia or China with several $1 million and no questions asked, just get out of Dodge. The stick would be very precise surgical strikes, including taking him out of bed and putting him on a C-130 back to Brooklyn.
The same way we did in Venezuela.
Thank you. Exactly. Those are the options. In between, there's just a lot of gesturing, posturing. I used to sit across the table from the United Auto Workers and the Teamsters and the Steel Workers and all that, and it was all bluster. I would sit down, and before we had our first breakfast, I'm already been, the F-bombs are just coming in. It's just that kind of stuff. I ignore that because that's not the answer. That is just bluster. So it comes down to this. We have to offer them a sufficient of a carrot that they decide to forego this and go someplace else, or it's going to be the stick. And now it will not be. I'll tell you what it will not be. It will not be. We still had Guantanamo base in Guantanamo Bay. It's not going to be thousands of Marines invading the eastern shore of Cuba. That's not going to happen. Like I said, the most that can happen would be a very precise strike for a very specific reason. They have seen what happened to Maduro. And I don't know if you recall that when Maduro was captured, 32 of his security members were killed. You remember that?
Yeah.
All 32 of them were Cubans.
Mm-hmm.
Do you remember that?
Because, I did not know that, no.
Yes, for two reasons. One, he couldn't trust the Venezuelans, and two, Cuban security was trained by the KGB, the Russians, basically, and the Chinese. They're the best mercenaries that he could afford. And money's no object, so that's who he chose. So it would be that kind of scenario. Now, in the meantime, imagine if the U.S. Army in the United States owned the revenue for the Hilton and the Ritz-Carlton and the Holiday Inn. It's the Cuban Army that runs those hotels in Cuba. It's the Cuban Army who reaps 100% of the gross revenue from those hotels. That's why we have to discourage tourism to Cuba, because all you're doing is you're not helping the people, and the people who do work there, they get paid miserable. By the way, Cubans earn an average of $15 to $16 a month from the Cuban government, because that's the only place you can work.
So in other words, that's why I presume that you, not just because you're a Republican candidate and maybe don't have a ton of affection for the policies of the Obama administration.
Correct.
Okay, see.
I got a good one for you.
But I want to ask you just briefly, when the Obama administration opened up relations, I suspect you were saying, look, this doesn't actually help the people.
No,
exactly.
It never did.
Right.
So it did not. But I do want to always think about the positive side. Listen to this. In the United States, we have a clear monument to what the Cuban people can build, and it's called Miami. Who said that?
I don't know.
Barack Hussein Obama in 2016.
It's true.
I have it right here. So the point is that he may have meant well. Let's just give him the credit for that, just the benefit of the doubt. but you can't sustain a system where the country's army is the recipient of all the revenue.
Yeah.
And you don't and you prohibit people from cutting hair for a fee.
So a couple of things I want you to react to some of Jason's points. But before we get that, just briefly on Venezuela. I don't know how to assess. I think we're going to need time to assess whether the action has, quote unquote, been successful in Venezuela.
Agreed.
Because the person in charge now was Maduro's second in command. That regime is still largely in place. The idea is the Trump administration is keeping a watchful eye on their actions.
Right.
But when we talk to Venezuelan Americans, Venezuelan people from the Venezuelan diaspora, they've been in this program largely saying, I mean, I don't know anybody loves Maduro. They hate Maduro.
Okay. Yeah.
Wept with joy when he's gone.
Yeah.
But want a true change, a true opportunity for liberty.
Right.
And they still have family and friends in Venezuela who will not text to them because they're fearful that the government is reading their messages.
Correct.
And they feel like to this moment, nothing has fundamentally changed. So it's possible over time that the seeds for change are there and they'll unfold. But I don't think you could look at Venezuela right now and say, well, that's a totally different situation. For the people, they're still suffering. We'll see.
Right.
Are you confident that in Cuba, the leadership could either take the deal you're describing, go off to Russia, take your millions, no one will bother you as long as you shut up about it.
I'm just,
I understand what you're saying. I understand what you're saying. Or we'll take you out ourselves.
Yeah.
That's what you want to see. But would the next people in charge be different?
Right. The next people in charge would be different. They're residing.
They would be different?
Yeah. They're residing in Miami right now, and they just can't wait to go there and start fixing things up and make them better. And we have, as Obama said, we have the wherewithal to do that. Literally the money to do that. I can't tell you how many millionaire Cubans I know.
Go to the University of Miami. They have a plan of how they're
God.
going to remodel Havana in the basement.
Yeah. So that is just waiting in the wings. And what we need is for the Cuban military to put their weapons down and just use law and order instead of trying to prosecute, hundreds of thousands of people at any given time for simply raising the hand and saying, I want to eat,
Yeah. And Cuba is not Iran. I mean, Iran is proving to be a massive challenge because even with the regime change decapitation of a dozen of the top leaders, they have not dislodged that regime, and it's going to be very, very difficult.
Yes.
Cuba's different. It's smaller. I understand that.
Right.
But to Jason's point, are you concerned that the propaganda that for decades the Castro regime has said, America hates you,
Yeah, that works on some people I know. I know. Are you ready for this? I can name names. There's a young lady in Miami now who almost became part of my family, who escaped from Cuba, went to Spain, came to Miami. She's still in Miami. She's my friend on Facebook. She's a communist. And she's a communist in Miami who always who hates everything that I support. She almost married my cousin. And the point is that, you got people like Mayorkas is a Cuban communist. And what used to be the AG for the city of Los Angeles is a Cuban communist. So there are people in Cuba and in Miami who support communism, or at least when it benefits them in some kind of economic way and so forth. As long as they're on the top of the heap, they don't care what happens. So there are people like that. But back to your question, we are ready to do something. The Venezuelans, frankly, I know Venezuelans. I haven't discussed this topic with them specifically, but there's a lady across the street from me who goes to Venezuela frequently at this point, and she's happy that that things are changing. They're not changing to the extent, as you pointed out correctly, that they're not changing to the extent we had hoped by this time.
And again, maybe they will.
And maybe they will, and we have to
know.
at least we don't have to take out another Maduro. I don't think, and in Venezuela, and I hope that the people in Venezuela who got their act together can make a positive difference in the sense that they have a scheme, a number of people, and a number of principles that will cause X number of people plus one to want that regime, a new regime.
So, Jason, do you feel like dislodging this regime, whether it's the carrot and stick that Luis described, whether it's the carrot or the stick, would it lead to a better government? Do you agree that there's people who could come in and make real change?
I do think, as somebody who's grown up with that idea that Cubans can do anything, we're just we created modern television. Desi Arnaz is a great example of that. Like you can't put our culture down. But I agree with you. I think it is a carrot and the stick in some elements, but you have to get rid of the regime. And what worries me is, Rubio's gone and talked with Raul's grandson, who is my age. And I'm like, that's not going to help the Cuban Americans who have all the resources and money in Miami, because they're just going to be like, well, you're just going to talk to another Castro? Right. Like, it's just, to me, that's not the way to do it. If you're going to replace somebody that the Castros handpicked with the grandson of a Castro, doesn't make any practical sense to get like that change, that carrot and stick model out.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because in Iran there's been a lot of talk, and there's still a lot of talk about someone named Reza Pahlavi, who is the son of the Shah, who was obviously chased out in the late 1970s, and he's spent most of his life in the West. He's Western educated, lives in the United States, and he would like to be the next leader of Iran, or a transitional leader of Iran. And some of the Iranian people want that, and some do not. Some view him as, just another child, like a nepotism child of a previously corrupt regime. And if we stay in the lineage of previously corrupt regimes, are we really making change? So what you're describing with the Castros sounds to me like the same kind of fear that says, who are we choosing to go in there? Will they enact real reform when all they have known is how to benefit themselves and enrich themselves at the suffering of others? And it sounds to me, Jason, like you can't help but be a little cynical or concerned about where this would lead to.
Oh yeah,
is that fair?
Yeah, it's very fair. It's I think there is a sense of, I don't know. I think like if you grow up Cuban, you grow up very cynical on both sides. You can't trust either side of the narrative, because you realize the narrative is way more nuanced and way more complicated, and like there's these myths and truths that even reading that article like that you sent me, it was the aspect of talking about how great the Cuban healthcare system is, like how great the doctors are. Used to be. And I'm like, it never was that way. I have photos I brought of just how bad it was in the 90s, so it's like that was 20 years ago. So it's to us, it's the myth that often Americans have been told, while the Cuban Americans are sitting there kind of going, this is not the stories we're hearing. This is not what we're hearing on the island. This is not what we're being told. It doesn't matter if we're Democrats or Republicans. We're hearing the same stories, and when we talk to both sides, it comes in a very, we talk to more Americans, it becomes very binary.
So, Luis, I understand. I mean, I can't empathize. I'm not Cuban, but I can understand Jason feeling like, boy, it's been decades. And whatever has happened, the Cuban people are always last. And so it's easy to feel like whatever change is coming, it's not going to benefit us. What are the conditions that you would need to see to be convinced that the next leadership is serious about actually benefiting the Cuban people?
Well, thank you. The conditions are the ones that we enjoy for 250 years, which is a constitution and a group of people elected to office with a democratic approach, and to make sure that that they have to allow, even China allows it, private enterprise, to the extent that people can create their own future through private enterprise, which is forbidden in Cuba. Everybody makes $16, $17. A brain surgeon has to drive a taxi to get American cash to pay his rent, because it doesn't matter how smart you are and how good you are. You have no more than $17 a month from the government. That has to change. That whole mindset has to change. So it's communism, and it has to be thrown out 100%. Not a little bit, like 100%. And on the medical model, oh my gosh, here's a lot of people don't know. I mentioned the 32 mercenaries in Venezuela. Yeah. Maybe some of them went there to make money, but a lot of them go there because they're mercenaries whose revenue goes back to the Cuban army. So doctors, and I have a family, a cousin who's a doctor, he would have ended up, if he had not escaped the United States, he would have ended up in Angola or down in Colombia or someplace as a mercenary for medicine. And again, the the revenue from his services goes first to the government, and then they give him something. And if he doesn't want to do it, you don't have a choice because they have your family hostage. And I could go on. So the point is that it is a completely repressive thing like you have never experienced. And the reason that the people can't rise up is because even while I was there as a 12-year-old, I could see the committees for the defense of the revolution, which are spy networks in every community. Every block, every neighborhood has at least one committee for the defense of the revolution, and they have the right to ask you, demand from you everything and anything that's in your refrigerator, what's in your car, where did you go, who did you go see, who's in your house, why are they there, how much money, how many eggs do you have in the refrigerator? They have that control, and I experienced that in 1961. So it's still here, and it's still there. And those things have to be overthrown. So that's a long-winded answer to your question. It's
I
drastically changed.
My cousin Carlos, who and his father, who just came here last year, they were educated professionals. He was a professor of film in Cuba and Santiago. Speaks 3 languages fluently, but because he had some friends in the July 11th protest, they came to his house. They said, get out, and he literally had to escape across, illegally because, again, Trump got rid of the dry foot, wet foot policy. And
No, it was Obama.
Obama did. Yeah, Obama did. Yeah, Obama did. Trump. Thank you. All right, correction.
Good,
yeah,
good.
Obama did. Trump just made it worse. Biden never did anything about it, and now you have almost a decade now, over a decade of people who don't have that asylum protection that our generation. Was received.
Yeah.
So one more question for the guest, and then what I'm going to do is I'll hand it over to phone calls and emails. Richard in Geneva, you'll be first on the phone. I've got some comments on YouTube in the chat there, and if you want to email the program, it's connections@wxxi.org. One of the things that the congressional Democrats who visited Cuba recently wrote in the New York Times was that they are very concerned about the energy blockade that they say the Trump administration has instigated on the Cuban people, and the results now are, I don't think they're saying there was never a problem before. I think they're saying it is extreme, that pregnant women are climbing stairs on their own because there's no power in hospitals to power elevators. The doctors are keeping babies alive on ventilators by hand because the electrical grid can't serve them. And this is a result of Trump administration policy. Is that true from what you've seen, Luis?
Well, what I know is that it's the embargo that they claim is the cause. That's not the cause.
No.
The cause is socialism and communism, okay? I have the receipts here. This is how many countries Cuba trades with. Cuba trades with a lot of countries.
He's holding up a paper for those who are listening and not watching on YouTube, but go ahead.
So this is a study by MIT. They produce it for every country. I picked Cuba, and I have the numbers here.
Mm-hmm.
Cuba went down 60% in 5 years in gross domestic product. The gross domestic product of Cuba today is 2% of that of Vermont, which is the lowest in the United States in terms of by state. So the point is that communism began destroying the island in 1959. It is actively destroying the island today, and it has nothing to do with Trump. It has to do with the fact that communism is the most repressive tool in existence today. It exists in North Korea, it exists in Cuba, and until recently in Venezuela. So that shows you that what Cuba used to have more head of cattle than citizens in the 1950s. Okay, now you can't even eat fish because you're prohibited. I have a friend that went to Cuba as a tourist, and he was prohibited from eating fish. Because if you catch a fish, you have to give it to the government. You have no right to catch fish. I'm not exaggerating.
Anthony Bourdain, when he was there, not even a decade ago, when during the Obama years, literally went to a restaurant and they're feeding him fish and no, we can't have that. And he literally had to give it to the cook who made it and be like, well, we can't eat this. And I have pictures, I brought, here's my tia from this is 99, from 1999. She died of preventable cancer that could have been treated here.
Right.
And I have another picture. Thankfully, I didn't bring it. We were just talking about the IV that she was carrying is one of those glass ones that you see in museums.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right.
And this is my cousin Sorrito and Moira Freda. I mean, their son had a cancer that, again, very easily treated in the United States, died because he couldn't get the medical treatment. The medical issues that were happening, that's just that factor on top of this kind of existence that has always existed there, where we've had to provide even just the basic medicine for Advil, Tylenol. We would have to ship that in throughout the 90s and 80s. We would load boxes of that stuff in luggages. So, I mean, that's just normal painkillers that we would just send over to the island. So that is just, and also if you went to Union City, New Jersey, you see advertisements for packages, or Miami, you see advertisements for packages all the time, which would be, these are packages that you would mail in with just medical supplies,
Right.
and some food supplies, and money secretly hidden in the medical supplies so that you can give to your family.
I have a Puerto Rican friend who is a pastor, and I have given him donations, and he somehow is from Puerto Rico, would go to Cuba, to certain towns, that Holguín and a couple other places, and he would have suitcases full of everything you take for granted, from aspirin to diapers to hygiene products and all that, toothbrushes and all that. And I used to donate syringes, everything. I mean, everything that you can. So the point, back to your question, Cuba had a gross domestic product of $2.4 billion. That's just $2.4 billion. Vermont has $46 billion. But that was in 2019. Today, they have $992 million.
I've got it at 1.4 billion, but it's still like it's about a 40% drop in just 6-7 years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
it's a huge drop, and it wasn't big to begin with.
It has nothing to do with the embargo, because they can trade with every country around the world, and they can buy tacos from Mexico and tomatoes from Italy. They can do anything they want, but they can't because they don't have the money to buy it. A country needs revenue from the production of goods and services, and they don't have any because they prohibit you from creating the goods and services necessary for
American
revenue.
Companies for 60 years have already skirted around the embargo. You can get GE light bulbs, but they're made by a French company, in Cuba. So it's like, and GE's still making the money. It's just how they just figured out ways around it. The embargo, it's more now, I don't know, to me it's more just like this made up idea, this boogeyman. Yeah. That it's so easy to explain it. It's like a good propaganda tool that I often see both on the left and the right kind of just go, yeah, it's our, but there is elements of the U.S. fault in all of this, because we haven't figured out a proper way. We haven't really worked with creating economic models with the island and pushing, the Chinese government or the Russian government to create, democratic socialist models or, capitalistic models that they've already, you've seen flourish in those countries. We could have, there could have been that dialogue years ago, especially under the Obama years, really to get the Chinese government to kind of participate in that dialogue with Cuba and to pressure them economically to do that. But it didn't happen. It's almost like it's been a second thought for the American government. And also it goes back to the Kennedy myths, the Castro myths. It goes back to that kind of years of the Cuban government, Castro playing with Jimmy Carter, with Bill Clinton, and creating or with the U.S. presidents and kind of like doing boogeyman tactics and saying, hey, I'm going to send a bunch of people over, or I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, We're now living with that image of that, all that cultural myths of Cuba. And I think right now the reality is it's very, very bad, and it's just getting worse.
So
Absolutely.
Let's take our only break of the hour. We'll come back to your phone calls, emails, and more. My guests are Cuban Americans talking about what's happening or what could happen in Cuba, given that the Trump administration has essentially announced that something is going to happen. A military campaign to remove the regime or leadership or some kind of change there. Jason Barber, Luis Martínez, my guests in the studio. Your feedback next.
Support for your public radio station comes from our members and from Bob Johnson Auto Group, believing an informed public makes for a stronger community. Proud supporter of Connections with Evan Dawson, focused on the news, issues, and trends that shape the lives of listeners in the Rochester and Finger Lakes regions. BobJohnsonAutoGroup.com. And Excellus Blue Cross Blue Shield, working with members to find health coverage for every stage of life, helping to make care and coverage more accessible in more ways for more people across the Rochester community. Details online at excellusbcbs.com.
This is Connections. I'm Evan Dawson. On the phone first is Richard in Geneva. Hey, Richard, go ahead.
Hey, thanks very much. I'm calling because I heard you guys talking a lot about Cuba and comparing it to the possibilities that happened in Venezuela and everything, but I was curious, nobody mentioned anything about Haiti, and it sounds to me like that might be actually a good example to think about in terms of how things could go completely wrong. It's a place where there were undemocratic and autocratic leaders in place for a long time, the multiple U.S. interventions, and it's disintegrated into a disaster run by gangs and other organizations. And I could easily see that some of the revolutionary groups that you're talking about in neighborhoods could reorganize as gangs, et cetera. What's to prevent the situation becoming essentially a failed state if there's too much U.S. intervention rather than a softer approach that, for example, opening it up and allowing trade? I take my response off the air, but I don't think, I just want to say I don't think that the possibilities are as rosy as what you guys seem to be talking about.
Richard, thank you. Richard calling from Geneva, listening on Finger Lakes Public Radio, WEOS 89.5 FM in the Finger Lakes. Thank you for the phone call. Let me start with Luis, because you're a little bit more optimistic about the notion of forced regime change, and Richard's concerned about a failed state.
Take a picture, look up some pictures of Havana in 1958, 1959 when I was there, and I was 10, 11 years old, and what I saw, what I experienced, and then compare that to Haiti. There's no comparison. It's totally, totally different. We have the wherewithal to be who we were before Castro became popular, and we can replace that all over again. And as Obama said, we can build another monument to progress, economic and electoral progress, in a matter of a few years, because we have the people, we have the knowledge, we have the money for sure. What we need is a change of the regime that allows private enterprise and fundamental human rights, which they don't.
Okay, so before I get Jason's take on this, let me follow up Richard's point with a question that I promise is actually related here. Do you support the actions in Iran that the United States is undertaking?
Yes.
You do? Okay, and under what grounds, what purpose?
Because right now, if this did not happen, Iran would be able to launch a ballistic missile into the Vatican. That is a fact. I'm not making that up. Look it up. Iran proved that they could launch a ballistic missile as far as the Vatican and hit it. We have an obligation for as long as I live to make sure that Iran, that Islamic states who think like Iran, not all of them are like that, but that one is, that people like that, who think like that, are not allowed to have ballistic missiles and nuclear weapons because they can reach our civilization with those things.
So here's why I'm asking, which, by the way, we'll set aside the missile conversation for another day, because there's new reporting from John Swan and others that Iran already has been able to reconstitute a lot of its missile capabilities even from the start of the war.
So we have to destroy it all over again because they cannot
shoot that sounds like
endless,
Vatican. That sounds like endless war.
Possibly. But what would you rather have? What would you rather have?
Do you think Iran is incentivized to shoot a missile into the Vatican? Do you think that?
Yes.
You do?
Totally.
Okay. So
have you listened to what they have to say?
I do.
How many times do they have to come and tell you that they want to kill you?
I'm not going to debate you on the war in Iran. That's not what I'm trying to do.
Okay.
I'm trying to understand your perspective, because what you are describing is not allowing a state that's led by people who think a certain way to behave a certain way.
Correct.
So do you support?
They're evil.
Do you support the regime change in Iran?
Absolutely, because the current regime is evil.
Okay.
Not crazy.
Okay.
Evil.
Okay.
Crazy is an involuntary condition.
And again,
evil
the
is
vast
a
majority of
condition.
Iranian people in Iran and around the world agree with you on that point.
Thank you.
There's no question. It's a question of if you can achieve it. And it's a question
we must achieve it, or your children and grandchildren will live under ballistic missiles for the rest of their life.
Now, as I said, Cuba is not Iran, and
Correct.
Cuba is not Venezuela, and
Correct.
Iran is not. Every state
It's
has
different.
its own characteristics.
It's different.
The reason that Richard is concerned is what he sees are optimistic attempts at regime change and failed states and failure.
I've seen
in a
many
lot
of them.
places.
I've seen many of them.
And he's saying that you are too optimistic, that in Cuba we could just sort of
I have
pick
to
and
be
choose.
Optimistic.
Okay.
I choose to be optimistic.
Okay.
It's a story of my life. It's a story of Cubans. We're optimistic.
Some of the most optimistic people.
Obama quoted it. So we know what we're doing. Okay, we're different. Okay, he began by talking about Haiti. By the way, the chief. I don't get too personal, but the person who saved my life with cancer is from Haiti, and he is a physician and a surgeon. So my point is that how they run their country and how what Cubans had already achieved mid 20th century are vastly different. So I know, and Jason agrees that we can do that all over again.
Okay. To go to Richard's point, what he was mentioning about Haiti, there is that aspect to kind of go with your point as well, that you have this military, very highly educated military, KGB educated, Chinese government military, but they're also opportunist. So there is this element of, you can easily, you have a huge wealthy base in Miami and Florida in the United States and throughout all of Europe that are willing to kind of go, hey, give us in charge, and money matters to these people because that's the one thing they want. So you may have this educated population, but to me, it's a little different than with Haiti. Like, you're not going to have these like war zones and fighting and infighting, because the reality is you're so hungry for everything. Even if you're a military member and who gets all the top stuff that you want, you still want more. Mm-hmm. And greed wins in that. And I hate sounding concerned. I don't like what it sounds like, but I think for those people,
Luis thinks you're becoming a Republican.
Oh, I'm not. Far from it. I am not becoming a Republican.
I didn't ask him. By the way, notice that I have not used those two words.
I know, I understand, but I think.
But I also understand there is this culture when you've had nothing for so long that, and you are a very educated people, that there is going to be that want for that structure to happen. But there's also going to be this dichotomy of it, like we look at, like the American people as capitalist pigs, like that's the cultural upbringing. My cousin Carlos and I were talking about that today. Like, yeah, there's this fat image that Castro described for decades of America as this fat, ugly pig. And now we have a fat, ugly pig as leader. So it's like the image now is like, oh, it's become reality. But the reality also is these people need that money. And those guys that you think could be turned into warlords, they're going to be like...
They might be bought. You can buy them.
They're more like what they were, like Baptista's men were back in the 1950s, right. Mm-hmm. with the mob. Mm-hmm. They're more of like those guys. Like, hey, you're the Santiago de police department chief in Santiago de Cuba. Here, right. Can you give us a casino? Sure.
I think
that happens everywhere.
But I think tied to Richard's question is, what's the worst case scenario? So we've heard the best case scenario from both of our guests, who I think there's some space between them, but there's a lot of agreement. Luis is very optimistic that a regime change operation can work.
Yep.
Jason's a little more cynical but hopeful, because Cubans are hopeful.
I don't think
but
a military strike is going to do anything.
No, it's not
I
about
think
it.
it's just going to cause anything.
Okay, yeah. But what's the worst case, Luis? Give me the worst case scenario of an American intervention.
That my children and grandchildren come to your radio show one day and still talking about Cuba the way we are today. That's the worst.
I'm the grandchild of a Cuban exile.
Right.
Okay. So a so-called regime change that doesn't actually change the regime.
It doesn't change anything, or it doesn't happen, for whatever reasons, and then it's an opportunity lost. This is the greatest opportunity we've had in 67 years to see something actually make a difference.
There's a what's that quote that I've grown up with? It's like, maybe next year we'll be back home in Nevada. Maybe next year. Yeah. That's the quote we've been told our whole lives.
Right.
Yeah.
And my mother is born January 4th, 1959. She's 67 this year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
She came here when she was 7. She's never both her parents, all my grandparents, all my tias, everyone who left the island, they're all dead.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. We have it. Maybe next year.
The next year never came.
Next year has never come for us. So now it's just like, what else do we have left?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so Rick emails to say, Evan, your guests claim the refugee community in Miami will make things better. I'm old enough to remember the arrival of the first wave of Cuban refugees and each succeeding wave up to today. What I know is that refugee community engaged in terrorism, bombing a Colombian airliner as part of its attack on supporters of Cuba, engaged in denying free speech to those who opposed their ideology and goals. I believe their leader was Mas Canova, and they have received enormous amounts of monetary support from U.S. taxpayers to enable them to prosper when others from the Caribbean were denied entry to the U.S. How do your guests explain what is different about the Cuban refugee population in Miami from what I have witnessed over 6 decades? That is from Rick. Luis, you want to
Rick,
start?
I don't know what taxpayer support the organization enjoyed, because I didn't enjoy any taxpayer support when we came to the United States. None whatsoever. Okay, there was a one-way ticket from Miami to Philadelphia. That was it, to get us out of Miami because it was crowded and the jobs were scarce. But other than that, zero. So then, if I know who the fellow that he's referring to, and to my knowledge, I don't know of any taxpayer support. However, there are those people who had lost everything. They were my parents' generation that he's referring to. I could see that they wanted to change the course of Cuba in their time, and they, like political parties, they had their differences. My mother used to listen to Radio Mambi, which was a Cuban, a free Cuba radio station in Miami. She listened to it 24 hours a day, and but it doesn't mean that my mother was a murderer or wanted to bomb some airliner. There are a lot of really bad people on the communist side. I can't emphasize enough that the largest killers of people in humankind have been the Islamists and the communists. That's verifiably true. And so communists today, as we speak here in this radio show, there has incarcerated hundreds of thousands of Cubans in different ways, means, and still has
to be clear,
political
Luis
prisoners.
did not say Islamic people. He said Islamists.
Islamists is very correct.
And I don't have the data to challenge or corroborate your comments,
I'll
but I
send it to you.
understand.
I'll be happy to.
I'm not doubting it. I'm just saying
it is.
in terms of the biggest killers in history.
Well, communism alone kills 1 million people a year to this day.
I'm not going to argue that
and
communism
Islamists began long ago before that.
I think one of the core things that we have to answer that question. There is a complexity within Cuban culture. Like, just to point out, there's a great book, if anybody wants to read it. Paula Ramos, the daughter of Jorge Ramos, who's, like our Tom Brokaw for Latinos. She wrote a book called Defectors that came out in 2024. Great aspects to understand the dichotomy of Latino nature. She points out that the head of the Proud Boys is a Cuban-American. The largest groups of Moms for Liberty is in Miami-Dade County. So there is a dichotomy within this nature of our people, within natures of all people in many ways. In many ways of our cultures, we think there's good and bad. And there are people who have committed those actions within the
Cubans are not a monolith.
They're not a monolith culture. We're not, nobody is a monolith culture. So when we talk about Iran, it's not a monolith. We talk about other countries, they're not monoliths. There's a lot of cultural nuance that is not talked about. And there's also a lot of cultural ideology that is so messed up, so complicated. The idea that one of the guys who led the January 6th attack was Cuban.
Sorry,
one of the Proud Boys leaders was a Cuban American. That to me.
But that doesn't disqualify.
That doesn't qualify, that aspect. It's just there is that cultural, that connection, and also a lot of it kind of goes back to the Castro myth. Castro came in. Why did Cubans seem to get a better professional treatment? Is because of marketing and branding. Castro killed it. He looked like a
propaganda.
He looked like he was a great propagandist. He looked like the
People
American Revolution but Jesus.
Yeah, the mistake that the United States made early on and continue to make for generations is that they underestimated Fidel Castro. I know him personally. His son was my little friend there for a while when we were 11 years old, and I saw him in person many times. And again, my aunt used to work with him, so he was just a very, very, iconic person in his time.
Charismatic.
Charming. And, you wanted to believe him. My parents, everybody in my family believed him until he showed his cards, and then it changed 180 degrees.
Well, here's Dallas who writes in and says, most people from communist countries don't like communism.
There you go.
That's true.
Yeah.
That's
Because
correct.
once it's imposed on you, it is imposed on you. You have no chance to turn it around. You have no electoral option whatsoever except to overthrow it. Because once they take over, that's it. They shut the door behind them.
We have less than a minute, and I hope in the months to come, because I suspect we're going to see some kind of action in Cuba, that you will come back here and we'll continue
Right.
to evaluate. So give me 20 seconds that you want to leave with the audience as we look at what's going to happen in Cuba. What do you want people to think about?
Want them to think about the kind of economic situation that they have in Cuba was not caused by the embargo. It was caused by communism, and we can change that. We can change that.
Jason.
I think the core aspect is we're a very strong people, and that we can, that whatever's going to happen, and I do honestly come on the optimistic side that Cubans will come out of it, and we will strengthen the island. And I do think it's absurd what Trump's talking about, but honestly, I agree with, we're going to make this through, it will happen.
Thank you both for being here. And Luis, by the way, brought in an old passport. 12 years old when you left the island here.
Yeah.
Look at these incredible pictures here. I wish we had more time to spend with it, but yourself and your uncle in this picture, is that right?
That's my little sister.
Oh, your little sister. I'm sorry.
She's a retired nurse in Miami now. My uncle passed away when he was 100. He was a rebel with Castro.
He almost looks like a little Fidel in this here. The beard and the rifle.
That was the Rieux at that time.
Thank you for being here and
Thank
come back
you.
and talk to us. And Luis Martínez, Jason Barber, thanks, guys. More connections coming up in a moment.
This program is a production of WXXI Public Radio. The views expressed do not necessarily represent those of this station, its staff, management, or underwriters. The broadcast is meant for the private use of our audience. Any rebroadcast or use in another medium without expressed written consent of WXXI is strictly prohibited. Connections with Evan Dawson is available as a podcast. Just click on the Connections link at WXXInews.org.